This program is brought to you in partnership with the Immigrant Legal Center.
Welcome to this first episode of Legal USA, an informative monthly program produced by New Americans Media in partnership with the Immigrant Legal Center, both of Omaha, Nebraska. Centered around 6 main practice areas of immigration law, Legal USA will offer televised and online general legal information. Lawyers at Immigrant Legal Center will answer general questions viewers have regarding the process of immigration law and cannot provide advice on a specific situation. This information is not intended to be legal advice. Viewers should consult a qualified immigration attorney to obtain legal advice on their issue or problem. Today's episode is dedicated to asylum and refugee status seeking cases. Shane Ellison is the Legal Director of the Immigrant Legal Center and a Special Assistant Professor of Immigration Law at Creighton University. Thank you for being here today, Shane.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to start with a question that one of the viewers sent, and it regards confidentiality.
Sure.
Will inquiries to your group be confidential? How can someone trust your group to maintain that confidentiality?
Yeah. So with respect to any inquiries that are sent to the Immigrant Legal Center, all the information that would be provided to us would be kept strictly confidential. This is because we have ethical obligations as attorneys to keep information confidential, and then there are certain privileges that attach to communications sent to attorneys so that people can feel comfortable sharing information with us. With respect to any inquiries sent to this group, for purposes of questions on this interview, folks will just be noting that the information is general in nature. We're not creating any kind of attorney-client relationship, and so it's just to answer general questions. But for purposes of legal advice, reaching out to the Immigrant Legal Center is a great option.
And let's start with a general question. Let's understand the difference between asylum and refugee status. Can you simplify that for us?
Sure. So the first important thing to note, I think, is the definition of a refugee. So a refugee is somebody who is outside of their country of nationality, who's either been persecuted in the past or who has a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. And so that's the international law definition of a refugee. If a person meets that definition after having arrived in the United States and wants to apply for protection, then we call it asylum. So asylum is the process of proving that you meet the definition of a refugee after you've already arrived in the US.
Okay, so that's the main difference.
That's
we'll
right.
go back to those two categories, but one question that we received dealt with the nationality of the refugee or asylum seekers as well. Are there countries whose citizens are not allowed to apply for asylum or refugee status?
Great question. I think the first important thing is to kind of break it down whether we're talking about people who are already here or people who are seeking to come, right? So people who are already inside the United States and are applying for asylum, there is no nationality distinction that would prevent a particular national from pursuing asylum inside the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be granted, of course, but there are no nationality restrictions on who can pursue asylum from within the United States. Now, if we are talking about people who are looking to come to the United States as refugees, then yes, the Trump administration had announced early on in its presidency that there would be a travel ban, or some styled as a Muslim ban, of individuals from certain countries. And so now in its third iteration, that ban is still in effect, and that is having an effect on individuals who would like to pursue refugee protection here in the United States. So for your viewers, the nationalities covered by the travel ban are Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and then North Korea and Venezuela were added as a part of that travel ban as well.
Okay. So let's go into the refugee status now in more detail. So the refugee, the person actually is not physically in the United States, but he is in his own country or a different country with the final destination wanted to be in the United States.
That's right.
And how do refugees get to the United States? How does that work?
Yeah. So let's take, for example, a Syrian refugee. A Syrian refugee prior to the travel ban likely would have fled Syria because of the conflict going on there. There is a significant amount of persecution obviously taking place in Syria, and so many Syrians have fled to neighboring countries. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, oversees or administers many refugee camps outside of Syria, looking to provide immediate assistance to Syrians who are fleeing. So for example, there are refugee camps in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon. And so the refugee, once he or she flees the country and then arrives in a separate country, will go initially to a refugee camp. And at that point, UNHCR will do some initial vetting and some initial determinations with respect to whether that person meets the refugee definition. After that, they are essentially placed in a holding pattern waiting to be resettled to another country. And so the United States, as well as many other countries around the world, accept refugees for resettlement in their country. So a Syrian refugee who would be coming to the United States may have been referred over to the United States officials adjudicating or deciding refugee claims, and then would go through another extensive process of vetting. 18 to 24 months was sort of the typical process through which they would have to wait. And then once they've cleared all the vetting, the medical screening, the security screening, so on and so forth, at that point they would be given tickets and refugee documents that allows them to enter the United States as refugees at that point. And then refugee resettlement agencies is the last kind of key step in that process, and those agencies would be the ones welcoming the refugees into the United States, getting them set up with their initial housing and their initial needs, furniture, these kinds of things. And so that's kind of the process in a nutshell of leaving to arrival.
To making it to the United States. Before we arrive in the United States, I have two questions that I would like to clarify.
Yeah.
Do the refugees pick the country where they want to go, or is just that you said that UNHCR, they together have the quota, this many refugees will go to this particular country?
Yeah.
Do the refugees get a say in that?
You know, so they don't get sort of a final determination, right? Sometimes preferences are given, or folks are tried, there's an attempt to resettle folks where they have family. So there are efforts made to try to keep families together. But no, there isn't, like, a refugee doesn't decide, I want to go to the United States, and therefore automatically they get to go.
Okay. And since we are talking about numbers and where to go to, can you summarize the numbers of refugees resettling in the United States currently, or an overview of the entire refugee resettlement, if we can do it in a few minutes?
Yeah, and feel free to stop me if I go too long. So the current refugee regime was created with the 1980 Refugee Act, and so since that time we have data regarding the number of refugees brought into the United States over a period of time. While I've not memorized all of that data since 1980, I can talk about the recent historical past. You know, since that time, there have been periods in which the refugee admission numbers have been very high and have been low, and they've kind of gone back and forth. Following 9/11, of course, there was a dip in refugee admissions, and those figures rebounded and went back up throughout the President Bush's administration, and they continued to rise under President Obama's administration. The last year of the Obama administration, the cap, which is set by the president in consultation with the Secretary of State, the cap was set at 110,000 refugees. So that would have been in the last year of the Obama administration into the first year of the Trump administration. That figure then was reduced pretty significantly in the first year of the Trump administration, and it was brought down to 45,000. And the cap for this year has been set at 30,000.
30,000. Shane, how many refugees if you have this fact, how many refugees have resettled in the United States last year?
So if we look at the last fiscal year, as I said, President Trump set the cap at 45,000. But your question is a good one because there weren't 45,000 refugees resettled in the United States. In fact, the number was closer to half, about 22,000 refugees were resettled. So when I say cap, what that means is no more than that number can be admitted as refugees. But it's obviously possible, as last year proved, to have quite a few less refugees admitted than the cap has been set.
Is that because there are less refugees in the world, or is it just that the process is tougher now?
Yeah, the process is a lot tougher now under the current administration, and the refugees worldwide were, because of places like Syria and Yemen, we're looking at levels of refugees that we haven't seen since World War II. So this is one of the worst refugee crises in a long time. And so the decreased number of refugees is in no way a reflection of subsiding conflicts, but rather a reflection of the policies of the current administration.
Of the current administration, okay. If we have time, we'll go back to that because I would like
Sure.
to cover the asylum status as well.
Yeah.
But before we move to asylum, let's say the person makes it to the United States, the individual arrives to the United States, he is assisted by the resettlement organizations. Now, practical questions. I arrive in the United States.
Yeah.
I have to repay the airfare that brought me to the U.S. By the way, you mentioned that they are brought here. Do the refugees afford the ticket, or it is paid by administration? If we can clarify that.
Yeah.
But this relates to the next question: when can I start work once I settle in the United States?
Yeah. So the cost of travel is not paid up front by the refugee. Instead, they're given a sort of loan to cover the cost of the travel.
Okay.
And then, yes, the expectation is that they will pay that loan back after they come into the United States and begin working. And the goal of resettlement is really for refugees to be self-sufficient as quickly as possible, plugged in and integrated into the community. So from the very beginning, they are authorized to work in the United States.
So first day here, they have the right to work.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And how about the driver's license and Social Security? I guess they are all connected. So
yeah, that's right. So the refugees are also eligible to obtain driver's licenses and Social Security cards, and a lot of that work, that early work, is actually done in consultation and in partnership with the Refugee Resettlement Agency. So these nonprofits that welcome refugees initially are so key in helping refugees get all of their documents together, because as you can imagine, it would be very difficult as a refugee who's unfamiliar with the language, the culture, certainly the legal system. Having to navigate all of those things can be a challenge, so it's really important that they have a network to help them get plugged in. So making an appointment with the DMV to get a driver's license after the person has been able to study and learn the laws that allow them to drive safely in the United States and can pass those exams, and then bringing their immigration documents, their work authorization card to the Social Security office would be the way to get the card, a Social Security card produced.
Okay. Now, you said that the process of coming to the United States or to be resettled to the United States takes between 18 to 24 months. Do I have it right? You referred to?
Yeah.
But it's a lengthy process.
Yeah.
Do they get the green card, the actual green card, or they just get a permission to travel or to enter the United States, and then the green card will arrive in the mail? How will they get the green card?
Yeah, so the green card doesn't come until after they've arrived in the United States.
Okay.
The first step is to be given travel documents and the permission, the authorization to enter the United States as a refugee. Then the rules state that 1 year after a refugee has arrived in the United States, 1 year later, they're required to file for their green card at that point. The green card then is, once it's granted, becomes effective as of the date that they entered. If a refugee doesn't file right away, let's say it's been 3 or 4 years, that's okay. The date of their permanent residence is still backdated to the moment that they entered, but we do recommend that refugees meet with legal counsel to ensure their eligibility and apply for that as soon as
So they still can apply for green card, although they haven't done within that first year that they were here in the United States.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I come by myself, but I've left my family somewhere somewhere else, can I bring my family to join me here in the United States?
So oftentimes refugees are resettled as families, and so they will come in together if possible. But if for whatever reason a refugee has been resettled and they're separated from spouse or children, there is a separate petition that they can file for their spouse or children. It's important that that gets filed within 2 years of the person being granted refugee status in the United States. And then there may be other options for other family members working in partnership with the Refugee Resettlement Agency. So any refugees who have other family members that they'd like to have them come in the United States, they should talk to the resettlement agency who may be able to help with that process.
But that 2 years, they need to remember that 2 years.
That's right.
Within those 2 years, they have to take care of that.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I would like to move to asylum status seeking. And do you know how many asylum seekers are currently in the United States? Do you have that number?
You know, I don't have that figure. There are many thousands of individuals seeking asylum right now. In fact, I know the asylum backlogs are quite lengthy at this time. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of people waiting in line for an asylum interview.
Now we have this growing number of asylum seekers, and a slower process, or almost not granting the asylum status. Why do we have this conflict? Is this a recent trend, or it has been part of the immigration history here in the United States?
Yeah, so it's both a recent trend as well as a long-standing problem. And so I'll go back. Under the previous administration, under President Obama, there were a number of decisions that were issued by the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the highest appellate body in the United States deciding immigration cases within the immigration system. There were several precedent decisions that were issued making it very difficult for people fleeing gang violence, for example, from Central America to qualify for asylum. By no means did it make it impossible for anyone fleeing gang violence to qualify, but it made many of those cases much more difficult to win. You know, there's a lot of ideas and discussion surrounding why that is, but the basic reality is that many Central Americans fleeing very high levels of violence, particularly in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, are fleeing violence inflicted by very, very powerful transnational criminal organizations or gangs. So they have, in my view, valid claims, but the law is operating both under the previous administration and especially under the current administration in a way that prevents many of them from qualifying for asylum.
So if I feel threatened at my country, I come over, I do cross unlawfully the border, but I'm pursuing asylum, and if I'm told, no, you can't stay in the United States, what happens to me?
Yeah, so at that point, it depends on a number of different factors, but if a person has entered the United States and filed what we call affirmatively before one part of the government, if that claim is denied, it gets sent over to an immigration judge where deportation proceedings begin. At that point, the person can renew their asylum claim defensively, we say, before the immigration judge. If it's denied at that point, there's an appeal up to the Board of Immigration Appeals that they can take. If it's denied there, there's yet another appeal to the U.S. Courts of Appeals, but the chances of success at each one of those levels become smaller and smaller as they go on.
And we mentioned 18 months for the refugee resettlement process and asylum. We understand that there is a big line for your case to be considered. In general, do you have an average time frame? How long does it take to claim your status?
And I'm glad you mentioned that. So the 18 to 24 months was just a vetting process for many refugees. Many refugees will have waited in the refugee camp for many years before that vetting process even begins. So for protracted refugee scenarios, people will live in refugee camps for 10, 15 years before they even begin the process of vetting to come into the United States. And I think the vetting process now is even longer than that 18 to 24 months, which is what it was years ago. So that's a very long process of coming as a refugee. If you're talking about asylum claims, that process can also be very lengthy. So, for example, I have cases now of individuals who've been waiting for an asylum interview here in Omaha for nearly 4 years, just waiting for their initial interview.
Okay.
And then once they have that interview, it could be another year or so before a decision is actually issued. Hopefully not, but it's possible. And then if the person is denied and pursues further relief, it could be even many more years after that through the various appeals.
Just one clarification there. Who makes the decision? Who interviews you? Or me?
Yeah. So if it's what I called an affirmative claim, it would be an asylum officer that works within the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, USCIS. It's a sub-agency within the Department of Homeland Security, and so they issue some decisions. Immigration judges can issue decisions, and like I said, the Board of Immigration Appeals can issue decisions, and in fact, the U.S. Courts of Appeals can issue decisions as well. So lots of different decision makers.
All right. And since it is complicated, so many people can make the same decision or can decide on a case. What difference does it make if a person has legal representation versus if they apply on their own?
Yeah, that makes an enormous difference. So a number of studies have shown that the single most important factor in whether a person is granted asylum is whether they have access to counsel. One study, in fact, showed that a person was 5 times more likely to prevail in their asylum claim if they had an attorney helping them prepare that claim than if they did it on their own. And part of that is because the law is such a complex area. Immigration law generally has been, it's frequently said that immigration law is second only to tax law in its level of complexity. It's a very complex area of law. But it also, asylum claims in particular, require an enormous amount of evidence and proof if you can get it.
Can I apply for asylum at the U.S. consulate or embassy?
No,
in my own country? You said that you need to be here physically, but I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, you cannot. As you noted, one of the requirements to pursue asylum is to be physically present in the United States, and so that means a person, while oftentimes in TV shows and things, people apply for asylum in a U.S. embassy abroad. That's not actually the way it works. You have to be here to pursue asylum and to pursue refugee protection. That process really starts with UNHCR, the agency connected with the UN that helps refugees initially once they flee.
Okay, and I would like to go back to the legal representation. Do I choose the attorney, or the court will assign an attorney, immigration attorney for me? Yeah,
so it's up to the individual pursuing relief to select and hire and obtain their own legal counsel. People oftentimes don't realize that in immigration court, if a person is too poor to afford an attorney, one will not be appointed for them. And that's true even for very small children. Individuals who are in deportation proceedings, in removal proceedings, have to find their own attorney. And if they can't afford one, the resources of organizations like my own, the Immigrant Legal Center, are available to try to represent as many people as we can or get people plugged in with pro bono representation. But the sad reality is that our capacity is limited. We can't represent everyone who needs our assistance. And so many people go through their removal proceedings without counsel, without any attorney at all.
All right. Well, I'm lucky. I got the status. I'm here in the United States. Can I get medical care and free services?
So, good question, and I'll make a distinction between people who are seeking asylum and who've been granted asylum. So, people who've been granted asylum or refugee protection do have the ability to qualify for some medical assistance, because that's a special kind of status that enables them to qualify for certain public benefits. And so that is an option for them. People who are seeking asylum, however, If they're undocumented, they don't otherwise have a form of status that would make them eligible to obtain, Medicare, for example, Medicaid, would not be able to qualify for those things. So the general rule is that unless you have a form of status that qualifies, you are not eligible to get one of those public benefits.
Okay. We went over at asylum and refugee status seeking cases, and we understand now that the number of people allowed to come to the United States under those two statuses is reduced, and there are some reasons. Can you please go over, in your opinion, why the number is smaller and why the administrations, and I'm not talking just about the current administration, why do we see the trend of having this number reduced?
So I think there are a number of things that animate it. With respect to restrictions in asylum, thinking back broader than just the current administration, I think oftentimes there's an inappropriate concern for floodgates. So presidents are thinking, or decision makers are thinking, if we recognize, for example, people fleeing gang violence, it's going to open the floodgates and lots of folks are going to come in. And I think that's an inappropriate concern, but I think that that's one that does exist. Another concern, and again, I think, in my opinion, this is very inappropriate, are security concerns. And I would say that's one that the current administration has really pushed, suggesting that immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers are either trying to game the system, are trying to commit fraud, or are themselves a security threat. And I don't think that that is correct. There was a study done by the Cato Institute that found that one's odds of getting killed by a refugee in the United States in a terrorist attack in a given year is 1 in 3.64 billion. So to put that into perspective, one's odds of getting struck by lightning in a given year is about 1 in a million. So you're more than 3,000 times more likely to be struck by lightning in the United States in a given year than one is to be killed by a refugee in a terrorist attack. And that's largely a reflection of the fact that this is a very vetted group. It's a very safe group. And so I think we can have faith in our process to catch folks and to only admit folks who are eligible for protection. And so I think the attempts to restrict protection to refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants are not really grounded in the evidence that we have so much, but it's more of a political posturing, in my view.
Okay. Why do you like to work with immigrants and refugees?
Yeah. I mean, it's, for me personally, it's always been a dream to work in international human rights law, and something that I knew was a calling for me, something that I really deeply cared about and wanted to do. And so representing asylum seekers and refugees is an opportunity to really interact with international human rights law here in the United States, representing people through that process. And the difference that it makes in people's lives is enormous. We've already said the probability of success is greatly improved when an attorney is present. And so by using my education and training, I'm able to make a real impact on people's lives, and that is what I'm in it for.
All right. Thank you, Shane, for being here today.
My pleasure.
And this was Legal USA, first episode of Legal USA. Next time we will cover family-based immigration. If you have questions, you can email us at legal@newamericansmedia.com by April 17. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again here on May 6th.